Professor, if I need to
sorry?
If I need to click on the presentation, how do I do that? Like, how do I access it?
I will then share it. Okay. So I did not start because I will just start to introduce you, okay. And then I will put the presentation on. I checked it before, so it works. Should work.
Yeah.
So I guess we can start. Ladies and gentlemen, it's my pleasure to welcome you to the second installment of the Olomouc International Law Lecture Series. The first one was dedicated to the issue of collective security, and we had Professor Erika Davedwit here from the University of Graz. Today we will move to another very important aspect of the, let's say, general security and international law, and that is the question of sanctions, which is a term which itself is very ambiguous still under international law. And not only legal terms, but what we can see and what we are facing is a very different perception by the various states of this world. And not only in the context of the conflict in Russia, between Russia and Ukraine. That's why we thought that it's actually a very good topic for this second installment of our series of international law lectures. And it's my pleasure that this suggestion was heard and welcomed by my two colleagues. First, Professor Rashmi Raman, who is a professor at the Jindal Global Law School in Neeli. And she's an assistant director of the Center for International Legal Studies. She's teaching public international law and human rights law and theory, and she writes and researches about the intersection of critical international legal theory and international law. Sorry, Rashmi, for mispronouncing your name already at the beginning. My fault. And it's my pleasure that actually we have the second speaker here in person, Ms. Kamya Vishwanath, who is a research assistant at the Center for International Legal Studies, also an international lawyer, and writing in particular about public international law from the Global South perspective. Prior to entering international legal research, Kamya worked as an associate in the dispute resolution team of a leading Indian law firm. She's interested in critical theory and its influences in thinking about the law and humanities harmoniously. So without further delay, I would like to give the floor to my colleagues. Once again, thank you very much for this, maybe the first, but hopefully not the last event we organized together. I will start the presentation and I'm very much looking forward to your presentation. Thank you. Is it working or not?
Okay.
Okay, then I will.
Am I audible?
Yes, Rashmi, you are. I'm just trying to make sure that the presentation works. What did it move? Sorry for that. Try to guess. Okay, I will move the slides for you if it's okay.
No, I can do it. It seems to be.
Oh, okay. It seems to work.
Yeah. Yeah, Rashmi, you want to begin?
Yeah. Just give me a go ahead when you would like me to start.
Please do.
Can you hear us, Rashmi? Is it okay?
Yeah. Can I
Okay.
start?
Yes, we can start. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. Fantastic. Thanks very much. And yeah, hello, everybody. What a pleasure to be here. And thank you very much to Martin for the kind invitation. We actually reconnected after a long time. And it is such a pleasure to be able to meet the colleagues at the Faculty of Law at your university, Martin. And it's an extra privilege for me today because my former student, who is now currently working with our Center for International Law, is delivering this lecture with me. And so, for two reasons, I'm going to keep my remarks quite brief. One, that I join over video, which is never as much fun as being there in person. And two, because I'm excited to hear my former student speak. And so, for these two reasons, I'm going to keep my own contributions quite brief. Let me not take up any more of your time in introductions. And now that I've thanked Martin for the kind invitation, I'd like to spend a minute talking about the topic that we selected for today. And specifically, as you can see, our topic is on the role of sanctions in contextualizing the response that states in the so called global south, and specifically India, have taken in the light of ongoing political crisis and disputes in the world. And at the time that we conceptualized this talk, what we had in mind was, of course, Ukraine and Russia. But in the few weeks that have passed between then and now, the focus has now cannot be meaningful unless it includes a conversation also on Israel and Palestine. And so I think that the timing of this discussion is tremendously important. And the fact that this dialogue is taking place between scholars like Kamya and I, who work in India, and the audience that is there today in the talk, it is particularly interesting to me because this is a unique opportunity for us to engage with legal scholars who are unfamiliar with the Indian context. And so, for that reason, I think that the question answer session and the discussion that follows this lecture is going to be particularly rich. Having said this, let me take you on a short journey of sanctions in international law. As I was preparing for this lecture, I realized that if I had to begin by giving an authoritative definition of a sanction, of course, I couldn't because there isn't one that has been accepted in international law. But what we understand as diplomatic or political measures that are between, as it's put, between words and wars. It's a cliche, but it's a helpful cliche because between words and wars is where the role of international sanction usually lives. On the one hand, we are mindful that any discussion on sanctions must have some aspect of a conversation on their legality, but also on their effectiveness, their objectives and effectiveness. And so, with this in mind, I realized that we should remind ourselves as a group of scholars who perhaps are already experts in international law. So, we don't really go back to the basics that often. But it is helpful to remember that when we talk of sanctions, we are not simply talking about sanctions imposed by international organizations on other states, on groups of states or individual states, but also unilateral sanctions. That is, sanctions imposed by one state or a small collection, a coalition of states on another state. And I think that the far-reaching humanitarian consequences of sanctions, um, which could, which could be from something as basic as sanction on travel, travel restrictions, for example, the simplest ones to understand for those of us who are used to looking for visas to enter into other states. We understand that there is no freedom really of travel, and a lot of it depends on the regime that one is in and the country that one is trying to get into. But also, this becomes much more complex when we look at diplomatic and political sanctions that result in an almost total embargo on goods and services entering the so-called ghettoized state. And so this really is the space in which governments and officials become the ultimate arbiters of this quasi-legal regime. We cannot forget that when one is speaking about really a critique of international law, it becomes quite meaningless to engage in the critique without having first dealt with the mainstream. And so the mainstream international law, which is up there on the slide for you to look at, and I'm sure whose drafting history is known to all of us, is the so-called Chapter 7. We are not going to go into Chapter 7.5 and, the strange spaces into which UN law and practice have taken us. But back during the time of drafting, the UN Charter itself envisaged a role for governments to play in keeping the peace. And, this is a particularly misused phrase. And I will be happy if all of us are able to engage in a heated debate in a few minutes on why keeping the peace is such a misnomer for something like sanctions. Because the unmistakably Western hegemonic creations that resulted in these words that you see in front of you, the text of Article 43, measures not involving the use of armed force. So they necessarily become a tool of using power to compel the performance of a recalcitrant or truant, or let's even say rogue state by another state. And what has happened in practice is that there is a Eurocentric, Western preponderance of these measures, of initiating these measures. And it then becomes, now that we've laid out the mainstream, now we come to the much more interesting, controversial space, which is, how does the scholarship of resistance, which is characterized by questioning the mainstream of international law, deal with such measures without giving credibility to the measures themselves? So, in other words, in order for one to become a party to the United Nations, one must be, one must fulfill the basic conditions of the Charter, which is in Article 2, this peace-loving, etc., etc. At the same time, one must allow other states to sort of school the truant state. And this idea of schooling is part of the UN's package of bullying, naming and shaming, calling out, etc., in a soft way to enforce compliance with the mandate of the larger state. Now, there's two interesting vantage points from which one can look at a critical appraisal of this Article 43. One of them is the so-called, let's call it formal dualism. And the champions of formal dualism are the whole range of scholars who have created the third world approaches to international law movement. B.S. Chimney, James Gutty, etc., are scholars in this. Now, the formal dualism model of the state suggests that when colonial international law embraces the narratives of progress, it can only do so if it internalizes the mechanisms available in mainstream international law. And the second vantage point, which is the point that I hope Kamya will spend some time unpacking for us, is the critical dualist approach, which is that how do we use international law to problematize the very structures, the ideology, and the practices of global capitalism that are part of the imagination of measures such as international sanctions. Now, these two vantage points, I think, will serve us well if we use them today to understand India's sort of ambivalence to international law. Now, and of course, I'm borrowing this term from Simon Chesterman, and I'm taking it from his work on Asia, but applying it to one Asian state, which I don't think is the one he had in mind at the time of writing that piece. But India's position to international law also really has been characterized by some amount of departure from the dualist tradition. Now, the dualist tradition, of course, requires that a state treats domestic law and international law as two separate spheres of existence, and suggests that the state that is truly formally dualist does not imagine any interaction between them, that they exist as separate spheres. in political theory. But if one is to take the vantage point of the second critical dualist approach, then it becomes interesting to interrogate India's own kind of experiences in engaging with the international law on sanctions. And I thought it would be anecdotal to mention that while I was reading for this, I came across a wealth of work on how sanctions used to be at the time of newly emerging independent India, an extremely powerful tool for the government at the time to protect the interests of the Indian diaspora in other parts of the world that had not yet attained a measure of full independence. So, really, it was an ongoing conversation on decolonization that the Indian government decided to formally adopt a policy to, to launch unilateral sanctions, which very rarely has happened in India's history, but did happen against the apartheid movement in South Africa, where India was the first state to impose these sanctions against South Africa to protest against apartheid. And the second instance, anecdotally, also has to do with the rights of Indians who were part of the diaspora in Fiji. And these are two interesting lenses by which one would look at trying to understand what was the logic for the Indian government, the newly decolonized state India, and its first democratically elected representation to protect the interests of Indians in a diaspora. And then one looks at, the other things that India did at this time, which was to engage in negotiations for CERD, which is the Treaty Against Racial Discrimination. And things kind of begin to fall into place because all of these are linked to the decolonizing movement and the struggle for independence against an imperial power. But for me, I think that a lot of the logic becomes quite murky after that, because in the decades that follow, India does not really take a sustained position or a predictable position in respect of unilateral sanctions, even though India's own history as a sanctionee is quite colorful. India had been sanctioned or threatened by sanctions several times. And unilateral sanctions by the US, most notably. Now, what was the impact of these sustained attacks on Indian domestic policy by external governments is quite interesting, because I think that it seems to have had psychological impact on the dualist framework of the foreign policy. And slowly the foreign policy really starts treating sanctions as a bad word. And this becomes interesting, especially when we look at other developing states in the last 50 years or so have seemingly also kind of been suspicious and resentful of economic sanctions being imposed by Western governments against developing and least developed countries. So there seems to be, it is absolutely impossible really to separate the idea of political coercion and bullying from the image of sanctions in the developing world. So this idea of collective security never really landed in states that recovered from decolonization. And I think that there are a lot of domestic considerations that seems to have played a part in India's experience and also sensitivity to sanctions. But it's quite provocative to think that this is not consistent, that historically the Indian state has taken a quite strong position on unilateral sanctions, even even at a time when it was possibly most vulnerable to destabilizing. Which brings us, and I will leave Kamya to fill in the gaps before I quickly fast forward many, many years and bring us into the present. Uh, and in the present, really, we are struggling to understand why this state, who at the beginning, the state which, when it was a new democracy, decided to put its credibility at risk and impose unilateral sanctions on a South basis, mind you, that is against an African state and also against Fiji, both of which are very much states in the global South. Now, why would a state that has historically um, not hesitated um, on imposing these sanctions and has also publicly supported many UN sanctions, which is the other form and the other flavor of sanctions, the ones that really specifically Chapter 7 is designed to talk about. How can the state now take such a ambivalent position um, in the face of a real crisis, a humanitarian crisis in the context of Russia, Ukraine? And well, perhaps the position on Israel Palestine is not so ambivalent, but at the same time, there is definitely something to discuss there. So, with this, let me quickly conclude what I had to say. And I really look forward to engaging in a more meaningful way with colleagues in the group who might have a take on these two vantage points. That is the dualist critique of international law and the critical, the mainstream dualist. So we have one brand that is the formal dualist, and then we have the critical dualist vantage position emerging. So with that, I hand over to Kamya, and I hope that we have a rich and productive discussion after the lecture. Thanks very much.
Thanks, Rashmi. I hope I'm audible. Yeah?
Yeah.
So, before I begin, I want to preface that this is like my first lecture here or ever. So, y'all are technically guinea pigs for me. So, I hope it goes okay. In case of any questions, please let me know if you want me to repeat something. Yeah. So, Rashmi's actually offered us a good foundation to understand what I'm going to be speaking about, which is India's approach to sanctions in international law. In fact, a lot of things that she has already flagged for us are the same things that I'm going to be explaining in more detail. Let me also say that if you're sitting here today hoping to know at the end of this talk whether we'll know for sure what India's stance is on the Russia-Ukraine war or what India's stance is on the whole issue with Israel and Palestine, I'm afraid that none of us will have that answer. And I need to say that right at the beginning. Because at the end of the day, I think what this talk will do or tries to do is offer the perspective that Indian states and states from the global south have to undertake and the tussle that they have with international law internally when they're approaching such problems. I think it's important to look at India's history generally to try and understand, like Rashmi said, there is definitely a formal dualism, which I'm sure all students of international law know. The idea of monism being something that's more used, that people in the European Union, that people from the United States, for example, but largely European Union, I'd say. So maybe everybody here might understand international law and your domestic system sort of work well together. In fact, a lot of things make sense. But the vocabulary of international law is somehow quite different from the vocabulary of domestic law. And for international law to play some sort of role in India, you need to have legislation that enables international law. And like Rashmi said, it's quite interesting that India at the beginning was very proactive with this. Quite different from how it might seem today. Interestingly, so as you may or may not know, India won independence in 1947, in August 1947, but was a member of the UN since its inception, which is in 1945. So technically, undivided India or unindependent India was a part of the UN. And the moment India won independence, if you look here at India's United Nations Security Council Act, this was enacted right after independence, and this is literally it. That's the extent of the legislation, which is basically telling us that in case of any measures under Article 41 of the UN undertaken by the UNSC, India will do its best to effect it and ensure that it adheres to it. So you can see here that India is pretty proactive towards this approach. Then we have to consider whether there is, say, anything more that India needs to think about. And as Rashmi said, there were only 2 instances of any kind of unilateral sanctions that India took against any country, which was against South Africa and against Fiji. Instead, however, in case of the UNSC sanctions, it has offered these kinds of prohibitions against a few states. So largely against what is commonly defined as these terrorist organizations like the ISIL, Al-Qaeda. Then there was specific statewide restrictions against Somalia, Iraq, the Democratic Republic of Korea, People's Republic of Korea, and Iran. So these were just instances in which India has applied a sanctions regime. And before I jump to the next slide, I wanted to spend some time on this idea of monism and dualism for a little bit. Because like I said, it's something that's more commonsensical for people within the European imagination. But for people from people in the global south, it's a bit different. Because as we've seen in history, countries in the global south have been the recipients of a lot of international action. However, they haven't really effected that kind of change. So when we think about monism and dualism, of course, in today's world and after scores of literature, it's not as reductionist and as simple as that. You can't particularly say that one state is XYZ and the other one is something else. There is, of course, a mixture of both. But when we try to consider it from that critical dualist approach, when we try to see what it is that countries that did undergo colonization, that were under the international regime, and then eventually had to move out of it, but while working through it, you see that these countries have fought their way with the system and through that system. So India is one such country which opposed vehemently colonization in different areas. Like, for example, in South Africa, which it was in fact quite vocal about and was actually the first country to raise this matter when the first session of the UN even happened. So the idea then of monism and dualism also strongly links to the fact that who has a say at the table here at the end of the day? Who can make that change and who can effect something to that effect, right? And so when you think of something like sanctions, it's a very interesting idea because, as we said, there's no actual definition of sanctions in law. But the idea of law being something that is coercive and that does make you do something, as Hans Kelsen would have taught us, is worth thinking about when you think of international law, because there is nothing to enforce that other than the state itself. So when we think about sanctions, we need to also consider India being this dualist state. We need to think about its domestic framework, because that's the only way you can effect any kind of sanctions regime, right? And while there is no direct approach that India has towards taking or imposing sanctions against other states or non-state actors, you might see that there are, in fact, like 4 acts here. In fact, actually, the second one is sort of like a subset or an amendment to the first. But these are different approaches that India has taken, and they have a bit of a colorful history, which I will spend some time discussing with you today. The first one is the Unlawful Activities Prevention Act of 1967, which was later amended with this Prevention and Suppression Order later on in 2008. And finally, eventually, we'll see how that changed as well. But the Ministry of Home Affairs in India, the Ministry of External Affairs in India, and the Director General of Foreign Trade are the different organizations and different entities which control who India can trade with or who it can't trade with, any kind of trade blockades and things like that. But whether these are an international concern or whether this is something that's only national, it depends on who is targeted under these different laws. So as you can see, the UAPA is the first one that we had here from 1967, later amended in 2008, and it was eventually also amended in 2019, right? So what's interesting about this is while this is the case, while it was effected with the intention of stopping any kind or sanctioning any individuals who are, for example, terrorists, who are known for certain activities, it doesn't necessarily have that impact in India. And I thought it was important to let people see that while there was the intention at the very beginning, when we saw it right here, they did want to impose sanctions. They were proactive to do that. The effect of this whole thing changed eventually when you see that the Indian government's sanctions regime is more directed internally than externally. If you look at the act itself calls for talking about different activities against individuals, associations. It's completely in line with the Security Council's chapter and everything. But in fact, the act is often applied against India's own journalists who might speak out against its regime. It's been flagged as having been misused by certain different organizations. So that was sort of the very overt way of seeing how India has approached sanctions in international law. And like Rashmi said, however, sanctions against India have also been important to see. India had conducted a few nuclear tests in 1998, against which US sanctioned India. And because of that, India and Pakistan actually. And the sanctions against India lasted for a while, which clearly affected India's economy. And at this point, I want to pause and think a little bit about what something like this does to a state and the kind of power equation that enables something like US to impose sanctions against India, but why necessarily it can't happen the other way around. And this is not to suggest, or this is not to simplistically say that one is always possible and one isn't, because politics isn't ever that easy. But it is important to consider that there is, for example, United States might impose sanctions against certain countries for human rights violations in those areas. But a lot of what United States might itself be doing in certain places might be considered human rights violations. However, you can't really see people imposing sanctions against the United States for these actions. And that's, for example, exactly the kind of critical thinking and approach that Rashmi wants us to consider when we're looking at a problem like this. In fact, a lot of scholars from the global south have said that sanctions, the idea of sanctions, while we've seen it as a definitional sort of idea, it's not as simple. In fact, while it is or it doesn't entail the use of force, people have often considered it a sort of soft war, right? I will read out what somebody has said. This is Max Agil, who has written for this blog called Developing Economies, and he's written that the US or the EU sanction countries not as an alternative to war, but because direct armed confrontation is off the table when peripheral and semi-peripheral states have not sufficiently militarized deterrent capacity to make direct war unfeasible. So while, of course, if a country like the United States were to now undertake war or force against another country, it would necessarily be difficult for them to get away with that. But scholars from the global south would argue that when you do impose sanctions, what happens? You cut off trade to a certain area. You don't allow movement of goods. You don't allow movement of people. When you cut off resources, you're naturally depriving a certain space of any kind of life to a certain effect. And that could affect, and that has often affected prices in these places, that's affected trade in these places, and has led to significant amount of, well, depravity in these places. So people have people have to, while speaking about sanctions, understand that this is in no way suggesting that sanctions in general might be, say, a useless tool because it evolved out of a time where it was required. But like Rashmi also mentioned at the beginning, the idea of keeping the peace is not as simple. And who defines what that peace is and what the nature of that peace is, right? So it's quite difficult for ex-colonies like India to grapple with something like sanctions or to directly impose them against another country. Because despite being a growing economy, which is what the critique against India and China is often, um, it is still difficult for these countries, which are still somewhere near the periphery in terms of their political power, in terms of the capacity that they have to influence policy or basically have any say at the policy table. It's quite difficult for India to make that claim and to back it. India is still reliant on a lot of countries and a lot of economies for their trade, for bringing in of manufacturing, for different kinds of defense, for oil. And I'm in this way like leading towards the problem with Russia and things like that. But yeah, this was US's sanction against India. So now we need to think about what the situation is like today, since that's what we're here to talk about. And it was interesting that this whole idea for this talk was conceptualized in, say, August, before anything happened. But I think a lot has changed. We had only one big war to think about at that time, but now we've got another. So it was interesting, and we did have to consider India's stance on two different wars while we were preparing for this. This is what Mr. Ajit Doval had said about India in terms of the whole Russia-Ukraine issue very recently, where he said that you must respect the sovereignty and territorial integrity of all states without exception. And they've admitted to providing humanitarian assistance to Ukraine and economic assistance to the neighbors in the global south. Why neighbors in the global south? Because all the sanctions against Russia have led to certain sort of impact in terms of the economies, in terms of Russia's being able to deliver oil to different places and whatnot. And as a result of the sanctions that have been imposed, again, this is not to say that this is a general critique against sanctions against Russia. This is just about why India, as a state in the global south, cannot easily apply these sanctions. So, for instance, energy and food prices in terms of everything that's coming in from Russia have increased. Prices with respect to wheat has increased by 30%. And for countries in the global south, this matters. A lot of countries in Africa are heavily reliant on Russia for any kind of produce. They import constantly from there. So technically, it wouldn't be feasible for these countries to sanction Russia or offer to sanction or sanctions against Russia for these issues because it's a direct attack against their interests. And often the discourse and dialogue in international law has been the bigger countries like the United States or the UK coming in and asking and trying to persuade these different countries to make that move to say, you should also stand up for these rights and you need to stand up for the human rights violations against Ukraine. And while that is definitely the case, politically speaking, it is difficult for the global south to take such a stance, given their dependence on these economies, whether we like it or not. So we come to this idea of what India thinks about the Russia-Ukraine war. And it's like Rashmi said, it's been called strategic ambivalence or neutrality, where it supports both sides. How does that work? Is that even fair? But I think it's once we've contextualized the situation, once we've understood the predicament a country is in when it has competing interests, because while it has supported Ukraine, while it has and continues to provide humanitarian aid to Ukraine, it cannot apply sanctions against Russia because it's reliant on Russia for its economy, for the functioning of people like me in its economy. So it is difficult. It is not fair. But what is also interesting is when we look at what happened at the G20 this time. At the G20, which happened in September 2023, a lot of different countries assembled in India, Russia being one of them, Ukraine, the United States, Canada, and everybody, amidst all the other discussions, had a joint declaration on the whole war, which is interesting because if you think about it, that becomes like a space for there to be dialogue and for there to be disagreement. That becomes a space for Russia to say something and Ukraine to say something else and US to say something else. But having a joint declaration begs the question of what is it that everybody just agreed on? And how did Russia and Ukraine agree on the same thing? How did UK and US and these countries agree on the same thing? Which leads me to the eventual idea that I think we all need to think about is that the way a lot of these laws are codified, the way the laws, I mean, not really law on sanctions, but the discourse around sanctions are codified, is in a language that is so universal that everybody can agree on it. And it's interesting, and I will continue to point out that the joint declaration highlights how, despite what US has done to try and push and compel other countries to impose sanctions against Russia, they were all technically on the same page here at that meeting. So I then moved to this idea of what a neutral party is. I think in the previous talk as well, there was a talk about neutrality and this idea of neutrality. And I think it becomes a little different for the global south when we're considering neutrality, when India is called neutral, or when there's talks of non-alignment, which goes back to the non-alignment movement, which India was supporting right after the World Wars and when the Cold War happened, where India didn't want to side with either the Soviet forces or the United States. And it was a coalition of India, Egypt, Russia, India, Egypt, and to sort of say that we will not pick a side right now. And it's been critiqued today to say, how can they continue to adopt this kind of idea today when the world is different, India is different, way more powerful? Is this even feasible? And I just want to point out that, or rather ask, why does it seem like there are only two options? Why is it either siding with US's interest or Russia's interest even today? Like, despite having all of this happen, despite so much time having passed, why are we still considering this not only like a Russia-Ukraine war, because it doesn't seem to be just about that anymore. It seems to be more about thinking whether these countries are aligning with the Western interests of imposing these sanctions or with the actual human rights violation considerations in the war. And I wanted to stress on the idea of neutrality because just because there is no direct action, it becomes a little difficult to consider a country or to think about what they're doing or what they're not doing. And I wanted to add this here, which is that international relations today seems to be more about words and not deeds. It seems to be about what a country says it does, right? To say, I stand with XYZ, I do this, we do impose sanctions against such and such a country. But in fact, in reality, the way to understand where a country stands is not what it says in a meeting, or is not what it says publicly through different discourses. Because while that could be one way of understanding its stance, what's more important is what actually happens on the ground. What has that country done? And so when you look at something like India, we're left with more questions than answers, like I mentioned in the beginning, because it's doing this, it's providing assistance, but at the same time, it's also not willing to sanction. And it continues, even today, to not want to impose unilateral sanctions against different countries for various reasons. So I wanted to offer some more provocation on this issue, given that I've only discussed one kind of war and there's another, which is what's been happening with Israel and Palestine, where this was a statement by the Ministry of External Affairs a while ago, where India has and continues to support Palestine's cause for liberation, right? And and they have done so numerous times. They've said so numerous times. And India has sent humanitarian aid to Palestine as well during this whole war. But there's also a lot of discourse on the other side. There's a lot being said about how India is strengthening its whole interest with Israel and might be, in that sense, jeopardizing its relationship with Palestine. And at the end of the day, if you think about it, I don't know if this is just a problem that India alone has, given that, sure, we're discussing this in detail today. But if we actually really think about the different kinds of, say, countries that have taken strong stances in some aspects, for example, like how US has decided to take such strong actions again in imposing sanctions against Russia, a lot of people have asked why the same hasn't been done for other countries in ongoing wars. Why is it that there are only certain actions taken, even though the actions are the same? It's just a matter of the relationship that this country has with the other country. So when you think about it like that, it complicates the issue. It no longer becomes just about whether you can sanction or can't, whether it's a matter of are sanctions good or bad, are they feasible or not. It becomes sort of colored in the context it's in. It becomes colored because of the history that we've spoken about, that as a global south country, as something that's been sanctioned, which a lot of global south countries feel that since they have been sanctioned, they know the pain that they've had to undergo when food was blocked from entering them and people were blocked from moving out. So it became difficult for these countries, and they know that this is not something that they would stand for in another place. Well, that's not necessarily what I would argue what India thinks. I think that there are complicated issues on both ends for India with all wars. And like I said, there is no answer to this question. But going back to what Rashmi had said, in terms of thinking about how we're going to start thinking about the sanctions question, I think if there's one takeaway that you should have from this entire discussion, it's that decisions taken by countries need to be understood in light of the context that they were made in. While India was so proactive right after independence, a lot changed. A lot changed with respect to its relationship with international law because of all the issues that it had with its bordering countries. A lot changed with respect to how it cared about international law, the approach it took towards international law, because, like we saw, the legislation that was meant for sanctioning or other international states and non-state actors and organizations were actually directed internally. It begs a lot of political questions, but like I said, the only takeaway here needs to be that the answer is never, ever quite simple. Thank you.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much. I guess we can now open the floor for questions and for comments. Since the lecture is being streamed also on YouTube, those who are watching online may pose their questions in the chat, and we will try to read the question and ask them. But maybe before somebody does that online, we can give the floor to comments and questions here and in the room. So I don't know whether there are any questions or comments here in the room at the moment. I see mostly students here, except the three of us. So I don't know whether there is what kind of questions there would be. Marco?
I have 2 points, please. Well, actually 3. The first are 2 questions, and then the last one is more of a point of clarification. So just to confirm, India has imposed no sanctions against the Russian Federation to date. Then my second question is, to what extent is India's involvement in BRICS play at least some political role in, of course, not sanctioning a fellow BRICS member? And my third point, maybe just a point of clarification. When you spoke of the Indian domestic framework, the legislation, you mentioned the first act you mentioned, the Amendment Act of 2019, which, as I understood it, it also makes provision for the domestic implementation of Security Council Resolution 1368, dealing with terrorism. But from what I was able to see, I just want to clarify, does this act not distinguish between internal measures and external measures, because you mentioned that most of these measures were actually turned in domestically against journalists and so on. So does this act not differentiate between measures that the Indian state takes internally on terrorism from a law enforcement paradigm versus like sanctions, which are targeted usually on the outside?
So far, in terms of the present war, India hasn't done or taken any kind of stance against Russia. In fact, it has bought more oil from Russia, despite a lot of embargoes being placed on this in other countries. So that's been something that India has been under fire for. In terms of, I think, the UAPA question, which you asked, you asked about BRICS. Definitely, I think there is definitely a political consideration for, in terms of that as well. I don't think it would want to damage that relationship that it has built, while at the same time, it also doesn't want to prioritize Russia over its relationship with the United States. So India is kind of balancing a lot of different kinds of interests, which is why at the end of the day, it might seem to be neutral, but I would argue that it's trying to keep balance, and it's trying to maintain a sort of rapport in a way which doesn't ruffle any kind of feathers. And in terms of the UAPA, well, firstly, the UAPA and all of that is sort of based on the UNSC Act, which, if we read the first act of 1947, which it had sort of enforced, and that deals not only with internal sanctions, but that's spoken specifically for external sanctions as well. So from that, whatever flows, the UAPA becomes interesting because the language, like I said, is so broad that, in fact, the 2019 amendment is something that has also allowed people to be arrested without any procedure. So it's the amendments have been largely politically influenced, but definitely not keeping in mind external concerns.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
I don't know if Rashmi wanted to add something more.
Sure, if you'd like me to step in. So I think that the question's a really interesting one, because the person who asked the question was quite careful in asking, is it that India has not taken any measures against Russia? And that reminded me that, throughout this discussion, we've kind of been stepping around what is the what is the legal responsibility here? And it's, I think that this is the elephant in the room, which is there a duty of isolation, under the draft articles the draft articles against internationally wrongful acts? We have, you guys know this, the duties of non-assistance and non-recognition. These are called the duties of isolation, which is to ask that is there a general obligation for a state not to interact with the state that is violating the peremptory norm? Or at least, is there an obligation under international law for a state, that is India, to refrain from taking such actions that would undermine the impact of measures adopted by other states to end that breach? And such measures, that is, measures adopted by other states to end that breach, are the collective security measures and the sanctions against Russia that are in place. Kamya interestingly pointed out that India continues to buy oil from Russia. And that is really what got me thinking about the draft articles of states against internationally wrongful acts. And it made me remember that the press secretary of the US, the White House press secretary, spoke about in a media presentation that India's import of oil from Russia does not into the United States is not considered as India significantly assisting Russia, because India continues to import, I think, 10% of its oil from the United States and imports 1 to 2% of oil from Russia. So what is interesting here is that there is no general obligation under international law to cooperate with other states imposing unilateral actions, sanctions against a state which is in breach of a peremptory norm of international law, nor is there an obligation to refrain from actions that reduce the impact of these actions. Now, this is totally against Article 2.5 of the Charter. So, yeah, I mean, I don't want to go off into this rant about RCWA and the Charter, but if there's any other discussion questions on this, we could, as a group, we could try and puzzle our way through them.
Then maybe I will take the floor and just also have a comment. And it developed nicely towards what I wanted actually to say or to comment on, because I think we still need to be aware that sanctions is very much something which has its political dimension and its legal dimension and legal connotations. And there might be different contexts, because if we go back to the time before we had the collective security system, before we had the UN and the Security Council, then we had the sanctions, but it was solely a political decision of the particular state or states to apply them. And then there was legal consequences. But this has changed significantly with the introduction of the collective security system, and for good reasons. And especially this was changed because of the most important and precious value which the international community has, and that's the peace and security. So what we have seen and what we are facing for centuries is that the unilateral way of enforcement of international law does not work. That's why we moved toward the system which we have, which I agree has a lot of shortcomings, a lot of problems, and there is a lot of needs to, let's say, change it. Nevertheless, the system we have now, even though and it's not reflecting the situation of Ukraine and Russia, because we do not have the UN sanctions in this case. So we do not have the body which normally decides on the measures to be taken under Article 41 or 42 to be taken by the member states of the United Nations in order to preserve or restore international peace and security. But if we would have them, then we would be far away from just saying or talking about, let's say, or considering sanctions as a purely political decision. because then we would have a different, let's say, legal framework, and we would have to consider this as a legal obligation of the states to employ them. And then for me, the question is whether if in such a case we would have, if Russia would not be involved and the UN would not be prevented from, let's say, impose sanctions in such a case by the mere fact that one of the countries here is a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. So if you would have this kind of sanctions, then actually India would be obliged to take action. Whereas here, just for this fact, because it's Russia and Ukraine, we are talking about the situation in different terms, where we are more or less relying on the very fact, yeah, well, we have a different perception of sanctions. It's a purely political decision. We have to take into account how we translate it into the interests, maybe also how is the legal perception in terms of national implementation of the sanctions, and so on and so on. So we have actually a situation, as I said, which in my view, is the only difference is that we have Russia on board as a permanent member of states, but still we are talking about it quite differently than we would talk in legal terms about the situation which would be the same, but not involving Russia or any other permanent member of the UN Security Council. And here I think that's whether this is completely right to let's say, shift that kind of discussion and to put it in more, let's say, political terms, just because of this, let's say, fact or solely reason. So that's, let's say, one thing I would like to hear your opinion about, whether you would agree with me or not really, and how this would fit if we would not have Russia on board, but if it would be Ukraine and another state, a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, and whether you would perceive this, let's say, differently, and whether we maybe, in political terms, also India would perceive this differently. And we have also not to forget that we have other powerful states which are not permanent members of the Security Council, but where the situation could be also very serious in terms of the impact of the international economy and so on and so on. So and then what I was also not completely clear about maybe is how the let's say, if there is such a perception, or let's say the Indian view, if you want to put it this way, is whether there is a much more stronger emphasis on let's say, this nature of sanctions as a primarily political decision with legal connotations, or how much actually Indian, for example, scholarship, but also maybe practice, considers the sanctions as or puts more attention to its, let's say, legal connotations. I mean, this may be such a general question, but since we are talking about, let's say, the perspective of India on sanctions, I think that this kind of question might be justified. Thank you.
Ashmi, you want to go ahead?
Thanks, Kamya. What wonderful provocations, Martin. Thank you for really summarizing the position right now. And I think that there's two aspects to the hypothetical situation that you have in mind, which is almost like a moot court situation. That what if it were not Russia, and also what if it weren't unilateral sanctions by superpower states that are permanent members of the Security Council that we're talking about, but they were UN sanctions, in fact. And the what if really is the key to the discussion. I think there's no end to really imagining the what ifs, but specifically, for this talk and for the group that is here today, I think that where this really comes to bear in terms of an interpretation of international law is the relationship between the draft article, the articles on state responsibility against wrongful acts, and the interpretation of the charter. Now, this is on the questions of aid and assistance that I spoke about before. That is the work of the International Law Commission Article 16 establishes the responsibility of a state that provides aid or assistance. And it comes to bear on this idea of a sufficient nexus. And the state practice on this is still quite unclear. We do have the jurisdictional immunities case before the ICJ. And I know that many students in the room will want to have a discussion on the procedural nature of the rules of state immunities, etc., in the jurisdictional immunities case. And the second part of this is on the idea that you suggested that this is largely political. Now, on the question of being political, this is a much much more opinionated space. Everybody has something to say on this, and yeah, there's people that want us to think that even if not supporting such sanctions is legal, even if it were legal, it's not necessarily a morally defensible position to take. And also the tone of the discussion, I think it's reached a point where this should not become a defense of the Indian position, because that's not at all what this is meant to be. It can be as easily an attack on the Indian position. But I think that what it's safer to be is just trying to figure out whether there is really an actual Indian position, because from everything that Kamya has suggested here, we don't have really an Indian position. So if push comes to shove, I think that is the only point at which the state will take a real call on this. And until then, it will just continue to be governed by trade and by conversations that suggest that India's energy supplies, etc., etc. There's a whole energy corridor in the EU that's at odds with the third parties in the developing South about sending, tariffs are going up, etc. So there's a whole lot of other aspects that which have to do with really trade law that are indicated in the discussion but are not really in the room. And so, there's no real point, I think, engaging with the what ifs to that extent. But I'm curious to see what Kamya's response is specifically on the legal part of what you suggested.
I find it difficult to separate the two as easily. I think that regardless of, I'm going to say this very simply but and very succinctly, but even if we were to consider just a legal approach to this problem, or if we weren't going to think about the political ramifications, I think that there is no escaping the politics of an issue, regardless of how the law is applied, especially given who decides the powers of that law, who decides when that law can apply. And that, I think, was what was underlying my whole thought of the Global South approach itself, which is that whether or not it's the law that comes first and you don't think about the politics, I don't know whether, given the colored history, especially with these laws, or especially with how a country like India receives international law, particularly for that perspective, I don't think it's that easy to separate the two. That, or rather say that one will necessarily influence the other, and the cycle sort of repeats. Yeah, I'm not sure if that's a clear enough answer.
Well, it was such a kind of question where I was not expecting to get a very clear answer, because there's always this interplay between politics and law. And finally, one of the things which I always tell also my students is that the law is a tool which is in the hands of somebody deciding, and you can perfectly decide not to use that tool. You can misuse the tool, or you can use it. But there was, for good reasons, the system was created And so if we use the politics to escape the system which we have, which is keeping the international community all together and ongoing, then we run the danger to end up in anarchy. And that's, I guess, not a very good idea. But if you allow, I have one question here, which I see, which was posted on YouTube, so I will just read it. Hello, thank you for interesting presentations. I have a question. Can India, as an emerging superpower, afford to balance between West and East in the way you described? Greetings from Prague. That's...
It depends on how we think of. That's a very interesting question, actually. And I think one that India is asking itself when it's doing this, because it's not easy as any kind of power, whether it's an emerging superpower or otherwise, to constantly have to balance such conflicting interests. And we're talking not only about Russia, Ukraine, and United States, we're also talking about Israel and Palestine and all these different issues that India is currently sort of grappling with. Whether it can afford to do that is I think, simply something that time will tell. But when we're looking at what India has done so far, it doesn't necessarily take much for what India is doing. So, like Rashmi also pointed out, United States didn't find, for example, this was that what India was doing with bringing in oil from Russia was something that was so drastically opposed to the global order. And at the same time, it's also a matter of like situation-based managing of interests. So while it is necessary for India to, I'm sure at some point, like Rashmi said, push comes to shove, make a statement on the war. And unfortunately, often enough when such things happen, it's something drastic. While that might be the only case where you might hear a definite answer, until now, the fact that it has tried to show both sides in its own capacity to the extent that it can, I think that's, like I said, that's something only time will tell. But it seems to be doing so far, and it has done so for the last so many years. So maybe it can continue to go on like this until push comes to shove. Yeah, Rashmi, if you have anything else on this.
I just wanted to make a very quick observation about how much India as a global superpower has changed in the context that we have traced the history of sanctions, right? And when we spoke about India in 1948 and India at the Security Council in the early 50s and 60s, taking a position against apartheid in South Africa, that state was very, very different as a global superpower from the state that today really is emerging as a global superpower. India was diffident, just emerging, newly decolonized, hardly a contender for anything in the league of superpower or global. But today's India is a much bigger player. And there's also an aspect of regional influence that has not yet been discussed today. And I think that's really important to understanding possible responses to this question on the West and the East, because in South Asia, India is one of the few stable political entities. We are surrounded by less stable entities, sovereign entities. And so there is also an obligation to balance that against possible geopolitical factors that will obviously be triggered should India try to take a more deterministic position. But, this idea, this indeterminacy of sanctions is really what the politics of international law is about. And I think that's why it's so interesting for us as a group of international lawyers to start wondering whether there is a legal obligation to cooperate with the states that are launching unilateral sanctions as if they were UN-backed sanctions. So, what is that tipping point, if we can call it? I think that is where a lot of our energies as scholars can be devoted to trying and identifying what the tipping point is for a state to start believing that it has a duty to legally cooperate under customary international law. And I think this is really where a lot of the disagreement exists in academic writing today. Thanks.
Thank you. I don't know whether there is any other questions. If not in the room, then we have time, I guess, for one more question, which is online. And that's a question from Kanan Venkataraman, who writes, thank you, Kamya, very informative. What has been the general position of the Indian government when sanctions are imposed on her by so-called friendly states, merely to send a message to others?
When sanctions are imposed on the Indian government?
When sanctions are imposed on India by so-called friendly states, merely to send a message to others.
I think India has been vocal whenever it has received sanctions, and it's not been sort of appreciated that. In such instances, India doesn't really stay quiet when something like that happens. But I mean, obviously, India won't be happy with such a situation if it were just to send a message. But nothing comes to mind as such about such an instance. If I'm being honest, Rashmi, do you know what this is?
I think maybe the question is actually making a reference to the Cold War era and the Russian-Indian partnership that came under considerable amount of strain when and this is what I meant in the initial part of my presentation when I said that there's been a psychological impact of the cost of economic sanctions by so-called friendly states imposed on India in the past. And I think that these are some of the factors that influence the Indian policy. For instance, in respect of Myanmar, which is another red flag that hasn't been raised yet today. And of course, it is my debatable privilege to raise the red flag that is India's position on Myanmar and the fact that India has not resorted to unilateral sanctions in its relationships with Myanmar is possibly testament to the comment that just came up about how India has been responding to sanctions that are used to signal power. And that is really the corridors of bullying, etc. And then we get lost in the political space of sanctions. And then international lawyers like us, we are left without a pedestal to stand on. So it's far more comforting and comfortable for us to consider, like I said before, whether a legal responsibility to cooperate exists for a state like India with an avowed neutral position that is subject to some push and pull. Yeah, let's say that.
Thank you very much. I don't see any more online questions. I don't see any more questions here in the room. Let me maybe just to conclude first in substantial terms by let's say reminding ourselves that we are in the times when the international community is facing a lot of problems on different stages. And so the states somehow seem to have forgotten the responsibilities they have, and especially the superpowers, and how it looks like if you do things or put focus primarily on, let's say, self-interest. The history teaches us that this was not a good idea, and we have seen what happened with, for example, the League of Nations, where the system which was invented after the First World War and which was meant actually to improve the situation was finally not working because exactly of this, because simply the states were not only, let's say, using the back doors, but also actually intentionally trying to evade and circumvent the obligations they had. This is not to say that the system is perfect, and what I think is one of many valuable points of these presentations, for which I'm very thankful to my colleagues, is to again raise the question about that what we need is maybe the discussion on the reform of the system, how to make the international law as a system acceptable and workable for all. Since in the times when the collective security system was made, in 1945, we had roughly, or not even, 50 states in the world. Now we have 4 times as many as that. So of course, the system which was designed in the time of 50 states, for various reasons, cannot work necessarily with 200. So there is certainly a lot of issues to be discussed. And even the sanctions is an endless topic. So I'm very thankful for the contribution of the 2 of our guests today. So Professor Rashmi Raman, once again, thank you, and many greetings from Olomouc. And Kamya, thank you as well for coming to Olomouc, for presenting, for this wonderful opportunity. And I'm sure that this is not. I'm sure that this is the first step towards many other cooperation events and activities we will hopefully develop. And if everything goes well, we will be able to welcome Professor Raman in the next summer semester here in Olomouc for a course. I'm mentioning this since we have students here in the room.
Thanks, Martin.
I'm not sure whether I shall also mention actually the course we have been talking about, but maybe you can do with one sentence the advertisement for yourself and for your course already at this moment.
Why don't I give this privilege to a former graduate of that course who is there in that room with you, which is Kamya. She was in that course with me.
Oh, I didn't know she was doing the Harry Potter.
It's the Harry Potter.
So maybe, Kamya, if you can say just 1 or 2 sentences about the course as such, just to maybe motivate the students to come.
Let me put it this way. I wasn't interested in international law until I did that course. And that course has nothing to do with international law. So that's how...
Oh, don't tell me that. No, please continue.
So that's how good the course is. I mean, it teaches you about how to read stories, and then you start to look at the law as a story. And things just, it teaches you different ways to engage with the law when you're also reading fiction. So I hope that's provocative enough too.
Thank you very much. So I allow myself to, let's say, close the session by this invitation for this course and also for the future events we will have. Once again, thank you, and have a good day to everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Martin. Thank you for the course introduction and for this opportunity. And thank you to those who asked questions and engaged so meaningfully. And I hope that this was able to give you something to think about. Thank you. Bye. I'm signing out now.
Thank you. Bye-bye, Rashmi. Have a good day.
Bye. See you over email. Bye.